The most motivating thing you can tell someone is that they just need more discipline. It sounds like accountability, it feels like truth, and it's also, according to a substantial and growing body of replicated research, almost entirely useless advice. Because the actual variable separating people who follow through from people who don't has almost nothing to do with discipline as a character trait and everything to do with something far less dramatic, something nobody is ever going to put on a motivational poster. For decades, the dominant scientific model of self-control was what psychologist Roy Baumeister termed ego depletion. The idea was simple. Willpower functions like a muscle, drawing from a single, finite pool of mental energy that gets used up through exertion and needs to be replenished, meaning every act of resisting temptation left you with measurably less capacity to resist the next one. It was an intuitive, compelling model, and it shaped an enormous amount of popular advice about discipline, sequencing, and self-control for years. Then in 2016, psychologist Martin Hagger led a large-scale registered replication report, a study design specifically built to test a finding rigorously and transparently before analysis begins. He coordinated 23 separate laboratories across multiple countries with more than 2,000 participants combined, all running a standardized version of the ego depletion protocol. The result, published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, found an overall effect size of 0.04, statistically indistinguishable from zero, with a confidence interval that comfortably included no effect at all. Roy Baumeister himself, present for discussions of the replication's findings, acknowledged it as a competent, honest demonstration that the specific procedure used did not produce the depletion effect it was designed to detect. This matters far beyond one academic debate. Because the ego depletion model was doing enormous quiet work underneath popular discipline advice. The idea that willpower is a resource you either have more of than other people or manage more carefully than other people. If that specific mechanism doesn't reliably show up, even under 23 separate controlled attempts to find it, the entire foundation for treating self-control as primarily a battery you're either draining wisely or recklessly gets considerably shakier than the poster-friendly version of the advice assumes. The marshmallow test didn't survive either, not intact. The other major pillar of the discipline narrative is the marshmallow test. Walter Mischel's famous studies from the 1960s and 1970s, young children were offered one treat now or two treats later if they could wait. Children who waited longer were later found in follow-up research to show better life outcomes across a range of measures. The finding became one of the most widely cited pieces of pop psychology ever produced, frequently summarized as proof that early self-control, essentially a fixed trait, predicts the entire trajectory of a life. In 2018, researchers Tyler Watts, Greg Duncan, and Haonan Kwan published a large conceptual replication, using a far bigger and more socioeconomically diverse sample than Mischel's original studies, which had drawn heavily from children connected to Stanford's campus community. Watts and colleagues found the correlation between delay of gratification at age 4 and later achievement was only about half the size originally reported. And further, that this already reduced correlation shrank substantially once the researchers statistically controlled for family background, early cognitive ability, and home environment. In other words, a meaningful share of what looked like a child's individual capacity for self-control was better explained by the conditions that child happened to be raised in, not by some fixed internal reservoir of willpower they either had or didn't. If it's not willpower, what actually explains the difference? This is the part worth sitting with, because if the two central pillars of the discipline narrative don't hold up cleanly under replication, the obvious next question is what's actually happening when one person follows through on a goal and another person in a broadly similar situation doesn't? Psychologist Wendy Wood's research on habit formation offers a considerably better supported answer, and it relocates the explanation almost entirely away from character and into context. Wood's research, conducted across decades of studies on habitual behavior, found that a large share of daily behavior isn't driven by ongoing deliberate decisions at all, but by learned associations between a specific context and a specific automatic response, formed through repetition in a stable environment. Her research found that when researchers disrupted people's environments, moving them to a new city, changing their daily routine, previously strong habits, both good and bad, weakened significantly, precisely because the contextual cue that used to automatically trigger the behavior was no longer present. This is direct evidence against the discipline as character model. If willpower were the primary engine, moving cities shouldn't meaningfully affect whether someone kept exercising. Wood's research found it does, substantially, because the actual engine was never willpower. It was the environment quietly doing most of the work, invisibly, the whole time. This reframes discipline from a fixed personal trait into what is, more accurately, an environmental design problem. The question isn't, do I have enough willpower to resist the tempting food in the kitchen? It's, why is the tempting food sitting somewhere I have to actively resist it 15 times a day, when a differently arranged kitchen would never present the temptation as a decision to begin with? There's a related, well-replicated body of research that gives this reframe a specific usable shape. Psychologist Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions found that translating a general goal, I will exercise more, into a specific if-then plan. If it is 7 a.m. on a weekday, then I will put on my running shoes and walk out the door, produces substantially better follow-through than the general goal alone, across a large number of studies and behavioral domains. Gollwitzer's research, along with subsequent meta-analyses aggregating dozens of these studies, found implementation intentions consistently improving goal attainment by a meaningful margin compared to simply holding a goal in mind and relying on motivation to execute it in the moment. The mechanism behind this finding lines up precisely with Wood's context-based model of habit, rather than with the discipline model. An if-then plan doesn't ask you to generate willpower on demand in the actual moment of decision. When motivation is least reliable and most easily overridden by fatigue, mood, or distraction, it preloads the decision into a specific environmental cue, ahead of time, while motivation was actually available to do the planning, so that by the time the cue arrives, there's no decision left to make in the moment at all. Only an already scripted response waiting to run. This is a structural intervention, not a character intervention, and it's precisely why it outperforms sheer resolve so consistently across the research. Recovery, not reward. There's a further finding worth including because it inverts a common assumption about the relationship between rest and discipline. Popular framing tends to treat rest as the reward that comes after sufficient discipline has been demonstrated, something earned only once the work is done. Research on the relationship between well-being and self-regulation suggests something closer to the opposite sequence. Studies examining this relationship over time have found current well-being predicting measures of self-control at a later point, rather than the reverse, suggesting that adequate rest and psychological recovery function as a precondition for sustained self-regulation, not merely a reward earned once self-regulation has already been successfully exercised. This lines up with the collapse of the ego depletion model in a specific way. If willpower isn't a battery being drained and refilled by rest in the simple mechanistic sense the old model proposed, but well-being still clearly matters for follow-through. The more accurate picture is that chronic depletion of rest and recovery erodes the broader conditions: mood stability, cognitive bandwidth, stress regulation that make consistent behavior achievable in the first place, rather than directly depleting some separate willpower reservoir being spent moment to moment. What this actually means for you. None of this research argues that effort, consistency, or follow-through don't matter, or that outcomes are entirely determined by circumstance, with no room for individual behavior to make a difference. What it argues, specifically and with real evidential weight behind it, is that the standard explanation for why effort and consistency succeed or fail, more discipline versus less discipline, a fixed trait some people have more of, is measurably the wrong model. One that has failed to hold up cleanly under two of the most direct tests ever run against it. The more accurate, better supported model relocates the explanation to variables that are considerably less inspiring to put on a poster and considerably more useful to actually act on, whether the environment has been arranged to require a decision at every turn or arranged so the desired behavior is simply the path of least resistance. whether the goal has been translated into a specific if-then plan attached to a concrete cue, rather than left as a general aspiration relying on in-the-moment motivation, whether rest and recovery have been treated as the foundation the whole system depends on, or as a luxury to be earned only after sufficient willpower has already been demonstrated. So the next time following through on something feels like a referendum on your character, on whether you simply have what it takes and other people don't, it's worth remembering that two of the biggest empirical pillars underneath that entire framing have already been tested directly, at scale, and did not hold. The willpower wasn't missing. It was never really the mechanism to begin with. What was actually missing in most cases was a plan specific enough to survive contact with an ordinary Tuesday, and an environment that wasn't quietly working against you the whole time you were busy blaming yourself for not being disciplined enough to overcome it.